So, thank you so much to Fiona for organising today's talk. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be talking in this space today. So often the hardest thing with these talks is working out where on earth to start and what to put in it. And as I was thinking about how it might be best to open today's talk, there was one image that came into my mind. And this is it. It might not look terribly exciting. I find it very exciting. It's a page from the new Earswick Council Minute Book that records a meeting that took place on March the 20th, 1911. And amidst the accounts of the many discussions the council members had that day, I found a reference to their agreement to buy a lawnmower of the type strongly recommended by the village's bowling club, directly followed by a relatively lengthy account of a recent fairy play that had been staged here in the village, in this room. The margin note in the minute book reads, lawnmower, fairy play. Now, I remember finding this page when I was very early on in my research in the Borthwick Institute in the University of York. And I was thinking about theatre and how theatre had played out in some of those key industrial spaces that we now connect with a heyday of British manufacturing. And I think it stuck with me because I was struck by how it made it clear that theatre was very much a part of normal, everyday discussion here in New Earswick by 1911. So normal that it's recorded as a matter of course after the decision to buy the new lawnmower. So what had led me to research here and at the Lever Brothers factory in Port Sunlight and at Cadbury's in Bourneville was a growing interest in how at this moment of accelerating and expanding capitalism and industry, a group of progressive industrialists developed ways to provide staff and others with recreational pastimes. They were driven by a variety of reasons: social, economic, political, religious and cultural. And I was particularly interested in how creativity was really encouraged as part of that activity. This was a generation of industrial leadership that placed creativity right at the very heart of what they were doing. A group of leaders that celebrated and nurtured creativity because they understood there to be a direct relationship between business, social reform, well-being and the arts. So this talk today, and I hope to talk for about 35 minutes, I will try not to ad-lib, will explore theatre in the first 3.5 decades of the 20th century. And it's divided into two parts. The first is going to explore theatre here, in the village of New Earswick, and the second, theatre at the Rowntrees factory. There were, of course, some intersections between those two sets of performances, and it's my hope that some of those will become clear or clearer over the next half an hour or so. So let's start with theatre. I've got too many things to hold with a microphone as well. Hang on, bit of a juggle. There we go. Let's start with theatre in New Earswick Village. So in December 1904, the Joseph Rowntree Trust was established, in part to manage the ongoing development of New Earswick Village, the rental of its cottage-style homes, and activities for its residents. The Trust controlled and governed recreational activities here. Ewan Colpin wrote a book on planned villages in 1913, and in it he described the Trust's role as providing New Earswick's community with such facilities for the enjoyment of full and healthy lives as the trustees shall consider desirable, and by such other means as the trustees shall, in their uncontrolled discretion, think fit. These two words, desirable and fit, were important criteria. And recreation that aligned with them became a key focus of the development of New Earswick's village life. By 1913, New Earswick Village covered a 120-acre site, of which 10 to 12 acres, so around 10% of the village, was reserved for recreation and play. And recreation and play were also the site of considerable ongoing financial investment. It's perhaps then unsurprising to find out that records of the first theatrical activity I've found connected with Rowntrees come from the village. So before the folk hall that we find ourselves in today was built, the assembly rooms, comprised of 2 houses, provided a village space that was designed to offer community recreational activities. Completed in October 1905, the rooms were open 6 days a week, from 7 until 10 o'clock, and they offered newspapers, card and board games, dominoes, chances to get together. The running costs were met by a subscription model, so you'd have to pay 6p to register, and then followed by weekly payments of 2p. A very practical application, I think, of Rowntree's intention, articulated in his 1904 Founders Memorandum, that I should regret if there were anything in the organisation of these village communities that should interfere with the growth of the right spirit of citizenship. I do not want to establish communities bearing the stamp of charity, but rather of rightly ordered and self-governing communities. Self-governing, that is, within the broad limits laid down by the Trust. So performance and entertainment quickly became important in establishing and nurturing this spirit of citizenship at New Earswick, as well as financially supporting it. The assembly room's opening was celebrated with a ticketed concert and an afternoon tea. And the concert element must have been a success, and we knew that because in January 1905, a concert committee was established here as part of wider discussions around fundraising for the village and its amenities. Entertainment then was seen as a source of income really early on. So we know the assembly rooms were really small, and as we might imagine, as the village grew and interest in the recreational activities grew, they quickly became not fit for purpose. They were replaced by the folk hall in 1907, and this building was purpose designed to provide a multi-use space, a hall that would provide a home for village functions, for sewing clubs and gymnastics, as well as for theatre. When a journalist for the Examiner visited in 1911, they recorded that as well as providing a space for multi-faith Sunday services, the hall was home to the Women's Guild, the Girls' Club, regular Wednesday evening lectures, the Choral Society, and a weekly Monday evening dance. This wide recreational use was central to the hall's design and approval by the company for the considerable spend that it was incurring. And Joseph Rowntree's personal secretary and self-described jack of all trades, Gulie Harlock, was charged with researching similar venues around the country in order to make sure that the folk hall provided the best space possible and everything it needed to. I've got a lot more to say about Gulie Harlock, but I'm not going to say it here. There will be a blog coming out on Gulie Harlock on the Rowntree Society website later this month. She was an extraordinary woman. So press accounts of the folk hall's opening make it really clear that theatre had been a key part of the construction project here. Stage performances were very much planned for and very much provided for. And the theatrical nature of this space was showcased, it was prioritised as one of the things that were told to journalists who attended the opening event. So the Sheffield Evening Telegraph reporter who came along to that opening event of the folk hall tells us that there was a stage in the main hall that was equipped with curtain, trap and dressing rooms. And the stage trap is important here because what that stage trap, that very little simple bit of theatrical design tells us, is that as early as 1907, the hall was designed as a space in which theatrical productions including spectacle, stage trickery and technologies could be performed. This was theatre to enthrall and to entertain. Records now held by the Borthwick Institute at the University of York show us that considerable investment was made in the folk hall. So the New Earswick Estate Annual Statistics 1905 to 1917, I'm not much of an economic historian, I don't often say titles like that, but this one is interesting, records that construction of the building and the provision of recreational equipment in it cost £3,888. So it's really hard to kind of generate equivalent money because of kind of cost of living and all the other things that change over history. But I think a really useful comparative figure here is the cost of 14 cottages that were built in the same year that the hall opened. So they cost £5,061. So we can see that from that this hall is costing a considerable amount of money for the trust at the time. So the hall's a major investment, and it tells us something, I think, about how significant recreation was considered to be in village life, and also, most interestingly for me, that theatre was very much a planned and well-resourced part of it. Theatrical activity quickly developed in the village after the folk hall opened, and by 1910, dramatic entertainments feature as a regular item in New Earswick's village council minutes. These records are fascinating. They offer insight into day-to-day concerns, logistics, joys, challenges, squabbles of village life, and provide an interesting social history both of everyday activities and exceptional events. Like the example I opened with, records of meetings from the early 20th century identify theatre as one of a range of recreational activities that were offered to villagers for their benefit. As with the fellow Quaker-driven business operation at Cadbury, there's no sense here that theatre prompted any more anxiety than gardening or cricket. Indeed, it's safe to say that in Rowntrees village in the early decades of the 20th century, it was billiards and the cricket team that were prompting greater discussion, consternation and disagreement than the village's theatrical activity. So why we might automatically assume and a sort of reticence around theatre in this Quaker-guided space, and I certainly came into this project wondering what sort of relationship I was going to find between Quakerism and the theatre in the early 20th century. It's really clear that within the Quakerism, New Liberalism, the New Quakerism we're dealing at this point in Quaker history, this hall, what took place here was part of a wider moment of change around long-standing ideas around theatre within the faith. So the first references I have found, and I'm going to caveat with us so far here in the village, identify it as part of the work of the Social and Educational Committee in the village. Minutes from a meeting in October 2010 referred to two short dramatic pieces that were in preparation under the direction of Mrs. Sorenson, and locates them clearly within the village's wider recreational management. Beatrice Drew Sorenson, I'm going to say that again because I think she deserves me saying her name properly without stumbling. Beatrice Drew Sorenson, or B, as she preferred to be known, lived at White Rose Farm, now the Garth, with her husband Carl. Now, the farm housed a cutting-edge Danish-style dairy and supplied milk for the cocoa works. And if you go looking for the Sorensons, you find out a lot of information about the dairy that you have to sit through to find anything else. Carl Sorenson was chair of New Earswick's village council at the same time that B was staging theatre at the folk hall. They were very comfortably off. The 1911 census entry sees them both in their late 30s, 2 years into their marriage, with a domestic servant and two dairymaids. Their daughter, Beatrice Anne, who was born in 1913, married Julian Rowntree, one of Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree's 4 sons. The Sorensons were both prominent figures in village life here in New Earswick and in York's Quaker community, and both are buried at the retreat in York. The Sorenson status and faith is important because what it does is it cements that idea that theatre was a socially approved and encouraged activity in the village very early on in its history. B. Sorenson's production was followed by that 1911 children's fairy play that was referenced in the first, I'm going to call it the Lawnmower Village Council Minute. A reporter from the local press recorded that it was a well-attended and very successful event. The folk hall, they said, was crowded, and the actors were frequently recalled or encored. The entirely child cast consisted of 42 performers, and the theme was interspersed with songs and original dances arranged by the conductor. Anyone who has ever tried to manage or produce a cast of children will be familiar with its challenges and joys. The stage isn't huge here now, and it was smaller then. I imagine that there were laughs, tears, moments of questioning the wisdom of the whole idea. But children's theatre really takes off in the early 20th century. And it was very much concerned with wider ideas about education and social reform. ideas that the Rowntree family themselves were key to propagating and developing. I could just put that in my pocket, couldn't I, and then we can see how we go. So, the folk hall's repertoire was perhaps a little bit more mixed than we might think, and perhaps in many ways children's fairy plays are the sort of thing we might be expecting. But in the early years of the 20th century, what was staged here gets a little bit more diverse and mixed. In November of 1911, we find B. Sorenson back at the helm of the village's theatre, managing a rehearsal schedule that lasted for several weeks before the performance. The choice of play is interesting. It was Florence Bell's three-act drama, The Way the Money Goes. It's about life in an industrial town and its many challenges. It was gritty. It was what many critics were dismissing as kind of thinking drama, boring drama, that wasn't going to use the stage trap, that was more about kind of political and economic life. Staged for the first time just a year earlier in London, it was in many ways perhaps a relatable drama, and one that had an undeniable social and political edge. That relatability was clearly identified in sort of pre-production coverage in the Yorkshire Evening Post in the week before it opened here at New Earswick. They described it as a Yorkshire play written by a Yorkshire lady and performed by Yorkshire village residents, to be produced in next week in the garden village of New Earswick. The same newspaper article tells us that by this time, B. Sorenson was recognised as a skillful stage manager. And I should note that stage manager here is a term that we sort of use director for now. So the term director doesn't really come into common language until sort of later on in the 20th century, first half of the 20th century. But it's a term still being sort of developed and explored, and people are deciding what it means. So when you hear stage manager in this period, basically it means director. She's in charge of the whole thing. The article also tells us that much interest is felt in the village in the forthcoming event. And for me that's exciting, because that's evidence of the other half of theatre history that it's much harder to find out about. The people who were watching it, the audience, the stuff with whom it doesn't happen without an audience, but it's very difficult to find sort of evidence of them. What's also interesting about this play and its production in a village space here in New Earswick is that it was taking place on a stage in a village that was designed to counter many of the social problems that the play was telling stories about. So the London premiere of The Way the Money Goes resulted in reviews that make a really interesting, strong north-south divide evident at this point in the early 20th century. So the newspaper The Athenaeum, which is kind of quite an exclusive London magazine that covered arts and culture and theatre, reported that Lady Bell knows the North Country character and the dinginess of the urban environment thoroughly. And she reflects them truly and cleverly in what is not so much a play as a series of tableaux, so sort of living pictures, street scenes and domestic interiors. So on this stage, in this village, I think, perhaps the play might have had a particular meaning. This was a theatrical production, staged as part of recreational activity, in a village space that was deliberately designed to offer an alternative to the dinginess of urban life that Athenaeum review is talking about. A dinginess of urban life not only encountered by people living in the north, but also in Birmingham, in the southwest, in London, in the southeast. And the Rowntrees were doing work to improve living conditions across all of those groups of people. They weren't only focused in New Earswick. The work they were doing here was designed to improve life for workers across the country and more widely through policy and practice. Check. By 1912, New Earswick's Village Council had a dramatic subcommittee that had 7 members, 4 women and 3 men, with a member of the local clergy also involved in matching with theatrical productions in the folk hall. A series of performances followed,
each making a financial contribution to the folk hall's running costs, with the balance sheet and accounts of 1912-1913 season recording a net income of £4.16. That wasn't to be sniffed at. Unlike other recreational activities, village theatre was by then not subsidised, but a net contributor to the community's finances. So following a failed attempt to form a separate dramatic society in late 1912, in July 1914, a letter was presented to the council here that was signed by over 30 new Earswick village residents, asking that a dramatic society be formed. The village council acknowledged that the proposed new initiative was going to replicate much of their own dramatic subcommittee's activities, and they suspended their own group temporarily just to let the villagers have a go and see how it went with their own dramatic society. It's an important shift because it marks a lot more input at ground level, I suppose, from village residents about what was staged and produced here in the hall, albeit still within that kind of wider governance structure of the council and the trust. Connections with the factory community also emerge more clearly at this stage. So there's a woman called Irene Mockett, who I want to look into a little bit more still, who is both the village secretary to the Dramatic Society and a senior manager at Rowntrees. And she, through her kind of activities, brings the two spaces closer together. Oops. This is the most fabulous picture I have to show you today. By the late 1920s, the Society were running a fortnightly summer school here at the Folk Hall for theatre. It was led by the actor, pageant director, male impersonator and playwright Gwen Lally. She was lead tutor. She offered classes in elocution, prop making, costume design, play design and casting. The village had become a recognised regional and national centre for theatre and performance, and this was the beginning of a long-standing partnership through Lally with the Women's Institute, Rowntrees and Theatre that would last into the 1930s. Reporting on the summer school, the Yorkshire Post noted that New Earswick Village has long been noted for its village dramatic society, which produces 2 plays, fully dressed, each year. They mean fully costumed, not that they weren't in the nude, just to clarify there. Haven't come across a big trend for that in the early 20th century yet. And in addition, they read a play once a fortnight, so that's like a staged reading of play texts. The selection made from both modern and earlier dramatists. Summing up the Society's activity in the same year, the magazine of the British Drama League, of which New Earswick's group was an affiliated member, concluded that since its birth in 1911, the Society has produced 160 plays. And until a couple of years ago, the subscription was only 1 shilling. It had just been raised to £0.50. It would be interesting to know if any other village society has given such value for money, they concluded. So, it's clear that theatre in New Earswick Village, multitasking, was the site of ongoing and increased development and investment during the first decades of the 20th century. The souvenir programme produced for the opening of the Folk Hall extension in 1935 again celebrates the facility and its size and makes it clear that theatre had been at the core of this refreshed design process, just as it was in that 1907 build. The programme notes that provision for dramatic performances in a hall of this size creates a difficulty, and the present compromise was only designed upon after consultation with theatrical experts. The result was a capacity of over 400 spectators and a stage of generous size having full lighting equipment of the most up-to-date type, proper stage curtain equipment, an orchestral well, dressing rooms on either side of the stage, and under the stage a large basement providing ample storage for scenery, etc. From at least 1910 then, theatre was an established recreational activity in the village here, and for many years afterwards. And at the same time, another set of theatrical activity was taking place at the factory up the road. I'm just going to leave all these bits of paper out of the way. So, established in 1890, Rowntrees' Haxby Road factory predates the creation of New Earswick Village And so why that might be, or seem to be, a case of me doing history backwards in this talk, there is some logic to it, because its theatrical activity starts just a little bit later. The socially progressive thinking that lay behind the creation of New Earswick Village also drove the management and day-to-day operations at Rowntrees factory. Employee welfare was a key business concern, at the core of running the factory, not something that ran alongside it. Staff numbers rose rapidly at the York firm, from less than 100 in 1880 to over 4,000 in 1910 and over 6,000 by 1920. An 8-hour day was introduced in 1896, a full-time doctor employed at the factory from 1904, pension scheme started in 1906, and in 1919 a 5-day working week became standard practice. The first edition of the in-house Cocoa Works magazine appeared in 1902, interestingly the same year that Cadbury's produced their first Works magazine, with a publication providing news for staff and information about changes. Kind of runner-up for best photo of the afternoon. In 1911, one of the first stars of the Cocoa Works stage arrived in York to start a new job at the factory. Brynhild Benson had been hired by Rowntrees as a gymnastics instructor, and she was based in the factory's social department. She trained at Dartford with, I can never say this woman's name, Martine Bergman Osterberg. Osterberg was extraordinary, a forceful advocate of women's emancipation in all areas of life. She saw her training programmes in gymnastics and physical instruction as a key way to achieve that, granting women health, strength, confidence and professional employment. Graduates of her college were highly sought after by industry leaders of the day. Brynhild had another string to her bow. She was also the daughter of the well-known actor-manager Frank Benson, whose company focused on productions of Shakespeare and who was to become central to the introduction of what we would now see as the state school subsidised theatre troupe. Her mother was Constance Fanshawe, a successful actress in her own right before marriage who continued to work on stage and screen as a wife and mother. Her celebrity father paid a visit to the factory in the following year, leading a session at the firm's boys' school. Brynhild's appointment was clearly considered to be a bit of a coup for Rowntrees. It resulted in a lengthy article and photograph in the Works magazine designed to introduce her to the staff, and she quickly became a factory celebrity. The beginning of her employment neatly coincided with the birth of the factory's Dramatic Society, and her performance in one of their first productions, Arthur Wing-Pinero's 3-act domestic comedy Sweet Lavender, in April of 1912, was well documented by the reviewer from the factory's Cocoa Works magazine. In her role as Minnie Gilfillian, the reviewer noted, "The role demands a degree of abandon rarely found in an amateur, but Miss Benson revelled in the part." That this revelling brought some obvious disquiet and criticism from others in the Dramatic Society is clear in what follows. The reviewer continued, "We have heard it murmured that the part was overdone, and at times too much attention was drawn away from the other actors." But such complaints were met with short shrift by the writer from the magazine. If that was so, the review concluded, then other actors should have infused their parts with greater intensity. The human drama that lies between the lines of this article makes me smile each time I read it. It's testament to the people and the behaviours involved in the theatre staged in the factory at the time. And Brynhild is second from the left on the back row there. So from 1921, factory-based theatrical activity delivered by the firm's Dramatic Society. Bear with me for one moment. Yes, that's right, I'm on the right page. Delivered by the firm's Dramatic Society, who at the time, and this is quite hard if you're searching for stuff on digitised text, were known interchangeably as the Cocoa Works Dramatic Society, the Cocoa Works Players, and or the Rowntree Players. became itemised in Rowntree's annual report on education. So it's the same way as we were seeing in the village. We're seeing theatre kind of put in the same column as education and as welfare. A listing in the Amateur Dramatic Yearbook and Community Theatre Handbook records that society membership was restricted to Rowntree employees, and that the factory's lecture theatre, housed in the new dining block that had opened in 1913, was typically used as their performance space and referred to as the factory theatre. Over the 1920s, the factory theatre group's productions became increasingly outward-facing. In 1925, Rowntree's Dramatic Society advertised their plans to come together with the York Amateur Operatic and Dramatic Society, the York Everyman Theatre, and the York Settlement Community Players to make up a cast of over 200 performers who were going to perform the pageant Drake, a huge outdoor drama that had been created by the king, the leader of Edwardian pageant design, Louis Napoleon Parker, in the previous decade. 7 charity performances were planned to be staged in the city's museum gardens, the last place the pageant had been staged in history, again for charity, back in 1916. And they were going to be directed, the press tell us, by Louis Napoleon Parker himself. Quite a coup, and it certainly attracted a lot of press pre-coverage. Oddly, there's little on the production itself in the press. And I'm beginning to get an inkling that it might not actually ever have happened. That's on my list to follow up in more detail, but my suspicion at this time is that the kind of awesome planning that you get the sense of from reading that probably proved a little bit too much to deliver in practice. Nonetheless, I think it's still useful to see that this is going on, because this proposed pageant model was really high profile, and it was showcasing and positioning the firm's theatrical activity as part of its wider collaborative civic activity, a really bigger development of the idea that theatre was good for communities, for well-being and for education, the same sort of ideas that we've seen in those village performances over the second decade of the 1900s. And it's also worth noting that that press pre-coverage attracted the attention of loads of the national fashionable press as well, including the Westminster Gazette, Sphere, The Sketch, and the Athenaeum. The following year, the players took part in the National Festival of Community Drama, organised by the British Drama League. Oh, that's not very good, is it? Thank you. There we go, now we can see them. The Cocoa Works group made it through to the regional final at Leeds Little Theatre in December, but that's as far as they got in the competition, which is a shame, as the prize included the option to travel to New York to compete internationally, as we can see in the newspaper column on the slide there on the right. You're right? Yes, you're right. On their return home, without having secured a place in that final, the local press surmised that it was the choice of play that was the likely problem, that their choice to produce a scene from John Masefield's The Locked Chest had been lower placed because it was not a local dialect drama, which is what most of the other groups have produced and presented. So it might be a case of sour grapes on behalf of the local press, but I think perhaps there's something more interesting there as well, that there was a set of expectations about what certain groups would be producing and the sort of theatre they were expecting to stage if they wanted to succeed and move forward. And this idea that kind of a local dialect drama would be considered better by the judges as a kind of product of a group coming out of the Yorkshire factory community. Sort of reminds us a little bit maybe of that staging of Florence Bell's play 15 years earlier, and that celebration of being a Yorkshire play about Yorkshire people performed by Yorkshire performers. I'm nearly done. We're in the late 1920s. By the late 1920s, the Cocoa Works Dramatic Society, or the Rowntree Players as they were still intermittently referred to, were well known. They were staging a wide range of work, 3 full plays each season, and attracting attention from fashionable national publications including Tatler, The Sphere, The Sketch, and The Graphic. You can see a couple of examples of those on the slide here. I think one is from the Tatler and one's from the Sketch. Both images show performers frozen for photographs. But it's still very evident, I think, these are very different types of stage productions in terms of their style. Pantomime had also become a regular feature of the group's activity, and a junior amateur dramatic society had been launched by this time. And they, amongst other things, staged a version of the pantomime Babes in the Wood in the Factory's Lecture Hall in 1929, an event that again attracted the attention of that range of national publications. These annual pantomime performances involved other members of the social department's gymnastics instruction team, so we see ourselves coming back full circle in history again. Edith Maunzel, who was appointed probably 2 generations after Brynhild Benson as a gymnastic instructor at the company, was responsible for choreographing all of the stage action, including a number of dances, as well as designing and producing all of the costumes for that production of Babes in the Wood. So throughout the early decades of the 20th century, I think Rowntrees theatre also offers us a window onto the increasing importance of theatre to both York's wider culture and that of the country as a whole. In 1934, Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree, Joseph's son, had co-led a group of prominent citizens who had taken on a lease of York's Theatre Royal to prevent its closure. They put in place a citizens' theatre, a sustainable, forward-thinking business model that was designed to offer performances by the best touring companies available, alongside productions by a resident repertory company. It's a model that stayed in place successfully throughout most of the 20th century and exists less now. I mean that nationally, rather than just in York. In the press that surrounded the initiative, the leaseholders were clear that this was not in any way designed to be a profit-making opportunity, but an important public service. Mr. Seebohm Rowntree particularly feels that his employees should not be without a theatre, the Observer reported. Joseph Rowntree had died 9 years earlier, but his conviction that theatre could work effectively as a tool for social reform continued in his son. The theatre that they supported in both factory and village was not for profit, it was governed, but it was also about entertainment, as well as recreation, business operation and education. Theatre was working in similar and in different ways at the factory and at the village. Factory theatre was part of the firm's careful brand management and focus on employee development and well-being. It was not just tolerated, it was considered an appropriate mechanism for showcasing the company and its commitments to staff, education, recreation and their health, as well as to a business operation that was guided by integrity. This was cemented at the moment that I'm going to stop today in this talk in the interest of everyone not being here all night, with the opening of the Joseph Rowntree Hall, later known as the Joseph Rowntree Theatre, in 1935 at a cost of £12,000. It's the moment that's often identified as sort of the beginning of the story of history of theatre at Rowntree, because it's the obvious build, it's the clear thing. But actually it's the result of decades of theatrical activity that already were taking place, and kind of the way that cemented theatre as a useful and powerful tool here in this part of York. In a project led by Seebohm Rowntree, the theatre offered simple architectural features combined with a warm colour scheme, hidden lighting, all designed to give an intimate, welcoming atmosphere. It sat 450 people at the time. I think it's a little bit smaller now. That's probably the onset of greater health and safety around how many people you can squidge into a venue. The early 20th century were better than the late 19th century with that, but still not great. It was equipped with up-to-date acoustics, lighting and heating, space for a 16-piece orchestra. This was a space to stage a business and its people. The build realised an aim to provide a hall which may be a fitting centre for those recreational and educational activities which make for a full and happy life. In this, there are clear echoes of the motivations that lay behind the provision of recreational activity very much earlier in the history of New Earswick village. So, to sum up here, I think theatre is important and exciting because it can help us to uncover the stories of numerous new Earswick residents and Rowntree employees whose voices have been largely lost to history. While the flourishing theatrical scene that was no doubt in place in both places was enabled by the leadership of Joseph and Seebohm Rowntree and moulded by their religious and social commitment, it was the hundreds of on-stage and off-stage staff members and residents who brought it to life. The performances that took place here in this space in New Earswick, in the factory's lecture room, around York and the local area, in Leeds, and later in the Joseph Rowntree Theatre, entertained thousands of people. And perhaps they can help us begin to better understand the realities of the day-to-day lives, beliefs, systems, and social and industrial priorities that lay behind them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Put the microphone back on. For that fascinating insight into theatre activities both here in New Earswick and at the factory in the early part of the 20th century. I've certainly enjoyed my last year working with Catherine and discovering some of these lesser known stories about Rowntree in the factory and here in New Earswick at the unsung heroes that Catherine has referred to. If you want to know more about Brynhild Benson, Catherine's blog is live on our website now, and as she's given us a little teaser that Gulie Harlock's going to be following along. We're also currently running, in support of this event, a social media campaign on Facebook and Instagram, and if you have a look at that you'll get to see some lovely photos of Brynhild, also of the theatre, the Red Joseph Rowntree Theatre, and some great photos of the Rowntree players coming up. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you so much, Catherine, for coming here today to be with us.